A child began to scream before he was born. There were no weapons, no chains, no light, only darkness, and something older than fear. In the shadowed corners of the outer rim, buried in the long decay of Sith legacy, something stirred, a spark of life that should not have existed. A child descended from Darth Bane himself. But unlike his ancestors, this child would not bring order. He would bring confusion, fragmentation, madness. He was born beneath an eclipse on an unnamed world, a remnant of ancient Sith burial grounds, long abandoned by time. His mother had no name in the records of the Sith. She was a vessel chosen by design or by accident, no one knew. But her bloodline had once been close to power, and that blood still carried echoes of the rule of two. The child did not cry when he emerged. He whispered. His first breath came not with lungs, but with visions. He saw a throne carved from bone, a world split in two, a Jedi falling to darkness, and a Sith begging for light. He saw his own death, again, and again, and again. They say Darth Cognos was waiting. She had felt the disturbance long before the birth, a fracture in the future, a ripple through the Force that even she could not interpret. Cognos, once the apprentice of Darth Bane's chosen heir, had abandoned faith in legacy. But when she touched the newborn's skin, she froze, not because of his power, but because of what she saw behind his eyes. 1,000 futures screaming all at once. The rule of two demanded clarity. A master, a student, one to hold power, one to crave it. But this child, he did not crave. He recoiled. He rejected. And yet, he had been born of Bane's fire. Cognos could not ignore that, so she took him. Not as an apprentice, not yet, but as a mystery, a question that had not yet been asked. She did not name him. The Sith had no need for names until power was earned. For now, he was only a vessel of prophecy, one spoken of in whispers, drawn from forbidden Sith texts recovered from the lost temples of Korriban. From the broken line, a third path shall open, not one, not two, but many. Cognos did not believe in prophecy, but she believed in pain, and the child felt pain without being touched. As he grew, he did not speak of what he wanted. He spoke of what would come. Empires falling, stars devoured, a temple made of red sand, and always the same sentence: the dark side has too many voices. No Sith child was meant to see this much, this young. By the time he was 4, he could name Sith Lords he had never been taught. By 6, he would fall into seizures when near Jedi relics. By 8, he would wake in the middle of the night, whispering to someone who was not there. Cognos tried to silence it. She starved him, beat him, left him for days inside the oubliette cells beneath her stronghold on Prakith. Still, the visions came. Still, the child spoke, and with each vision, her fear grew. Not that he was lying, but that he was telling the truth. He would not be an apprentice in the way she had once been. He was not like Bane, not like Zana. He was something else, something the rule of two could not contain, something it would try to destroy. Darth Cognos watched the child with a calm that hid her unease. She had trained under Bane's successor, faced Jedi hunters, and survived betrayals meant to end her life, yet nothing unsettled her like the boy. He moved with quiet purpose, not like an apprentice seeking approval, but like someone following instructions whispered from a future only he could see. Cognos understood strength. She understood ambition even more, but the boy carried neither. His silence felt heavier than rage, as if every thought passed through visions he could not escape. When she questioned him, he answered in fragments, half-truths shaped by fears he did not name. And each time he spoke, she felt the rule of two tremble inside her mind. Most apprentices feared their masters. Most learned quickly that survival required obedience. But the boy did not fear her. He feared something she could not see, something that pressed against his senses like a storm breaking through stone. At night, he woke in cold sweats, staring into corners as if expecting a voice to climb out of the darkness and speak his fate. Cognos began testing him in secret. She placed ancient holocrons before him, ones that once drove seasoned Sith to madness, but he opened them without fear. He repeated lines written by long-dead lords, sometimes in tongues she had never taught him. And when his eyes glazed over, she knew he was no longer seeing her. He was listening to someone else. She tried reaching into his thoughts. The boy's mind pushed back, not with power, but with noise. 1,000 overlapping futures, tangled like splintered glass, cut into her senses. She recoiled each time, shaken by visions of ruined temples, drowned worlds, and a darkness that did not belong to any Sith she had ever known. It was something older, heavier, patient. The rule of two demanded clarity, yet nothing about him was clear. He excelled in prediction but struggled with simple tasks. He sensed death long before it happened, yet could not sense a blade held behind his back. Cognos realized he was not gifted in the Force in the traditional way. He was shaped by it, consumed by it, trapped within its deepest currents. She kept him close, not out of affection, but necessity. His presence echoed through the Force like an unanswered question, and questions attracted predators. The Jedi sensed ripples from afar but could not locate the source. Other Sith acolytes whispered about him in fear, avoiding his gaze as if afraid he might speak their deaths aloud. Sometimes he did. One night, after a storm tore across Prakith, she found him standing barefoot in the rain. He stared at the sky as if searching for constellations she could not see. When she asked what he witnessed, he answered with a calm that chilled her blood. A path with no master, a future with no end. She realized then he was not predicting, he was choosing. For the first time in many years, fear crept into her discipline. Not fear of losing power, but fear of raising something she did not understand. She had taken him expecting a weapon. Instead, she had inherited a prophecy with teeth, and prophecies, she knew, had a way of devouring those who tried to shape them. Cognos watched him return to the shadows of her fortress, small against the stone, yet carrying an aura that bent the air around him. She sensed the truth settling like dust at her feet. The rule of two would not survive him. Whether by fate or madness, the child would fracture everything she had sworn to preserve. And as the storm quieted, she whispered a thought she dared not speak aloud. The future has chosen him. He didn't dream like other children. He remembered. At night, his body remained still, but his mind wandered places no child should ever go. Burning cities, screaming Jedi, ash floating over endless graves. Sometimes, he woke speaking names no one had taught him. Freedon Nad, Belia Darzu, Nihilus. He would whisper their legacies with the voice of someone far older than he was. Other times, he didn't wake at all. He just sat up and stared into the dark. Cognos had seen madness before, but this was different. There was method in the chaos, patterns, repetition. The boy's drawings smeared in ash across stone floors always showed the same thing. A pyramid crumbling into dust, surrounded by shadowed figures with bleeding eyes. He never explained them. He didn't need to. Cognos began to document the visions. She created a codex hidden beneath the fortress, a place where she transcribed every word, every phrase, every fragmented prophecy the child uttered during his fugue states. There were hundreds, some clear, some terrifying, and some familiar. One line returned more than any other. There will be many, not a Sith prophecy, a warning. At 7, he could no longer focus on basic training. His lightsaber strikes were weak, his movements erratic. He would pause mid-swing and drop the weapon entirely, staring into the air as if someone had just spoken to him. When asked why, he simply said, "The blade doesn't belong to me. Not yet." Cognos considered killing him. She had killed apprentices before, but something stopped her. He had started speaking in tongues, not ancient languages, but corrupted dialects only partially understood. He recited them like mantras, and though she didn't recognize them all, one thing was clear: the words weren't his. They were being given to him, through the Force, or something deeper. He feared them. She could see it in the way he flinched at his own voice. He would cover his ears and tremble, begging for the silence to return. But the silence never came, and neither did peace. He began carving marks into his own skin. Runes, ciphers, symbols that matched lost Sith manuscripts buried for centuries. Cognos asked him why. He answered without blinking, "So I don't forget who I'm supposed to be." The Force was tearing him apart. He was not its servant. He was its prisoner. There were nights when Cognos stood over his sleeping form, blade in hand, trying to decide if mercy meant killing him, or letting him continue. She chose the latter, but she would come to regret it. One morning, the boy emerged from the tombs beneath the fortress, barefoot and bloodied. He had been down there for hours, maybe days. No food, no light. In his hands, he held a broken fragment of a Sith holocron no one had opened in centuries. "I saw it," he whispered. Cognos didn't speak. She waited. He raised his eyes slowly. Tears streamed silently down his face. "I saw the end." And then, he collapsed. His body was failing. His mind had already fractured. But still, something inside him endured. Not out of strength, but inevitability. He had been born for something no Sith had yet dared attempt. Not to follow, not to rule, but to change the path itself. And in the silence that followed, Darth Cognos finally admitted what she had feared since his first words. The visions would not stop, because they were never his to begin with. He was 9 years old when he said the words that would one day destroy everything. There shouldn't be just two. Cognos did not respond. She simply turned away. But something in her shifted. The rule of two was not a suggestion. It was survival. One master, one apprentice. No more, no less. It was the chain forged by Darth Bane to prevent the Sith from consuming themselves. And for centuries, it worked. But this child, this fragile, whispering fracture of prophecy rejected it. Not with anger, not with rebellion, but with clarity. He saw something else. A path no Sith had walked in over 1,000 years. A heresy. Cognos tested him again. Harder this time. Torture, deprivation, mental invasion through the Force. She wanted to break the idea before it grew, but it was already too late. The vision had taken root, and visions do not bend. He began to question everything. The rule, the legacy, even Bane himself. Why only one apprentice? He asked. Why not 10? 100? Why limit the power if the dark side is infinite? Cognos responded with pain. He did not scream. He only whispered, "Limiting power creates fear. Fear creates weakness." And in that moment, she saw it. He wasn't rejecting Bane. He was surpassing him. Not with might, but with belief. This was no longer about training. It was becoming something else. A doctrine. A prophecy unfolding before her eyes. One evening, as ash blew across the broken towers of Prakith, the boy came to her chambers. Uninvited, unshaken, he stood still for several minutes, not speaking, just watching her. Then, calmly, he said, "I will leave, you won't stop me." Cognos stared at him, waiting for defiance, threat, pleading. There was none. Just a boy whose body trembled from within, but whose eyes no longer feared death. "I saw it," he continued. "The future. The rule of two ends with failure. Another will rise, but he won't be alone." Cognos ignited her blade. He didn't move. "I am not your enemy," he said, "and you are not my master." Then, slowly, he walked away. No guards tried to stop him. No chains were summoned, because deep down, even Cognos knew he could not be contained. Not by fear, not by tradition, not by her. She let him go, not because she believed him, but because she knew the Force had made its decision. The Sith would never be the same. From that day forward, his name was erased from her records. He was no longer her apprentice, no longer Bane's heir. He had become something worse, a deviation, a scar on the line of succession. And though she would train others, and the rule of two would persist for centuries more, a seed had been planted in the dark, a heresy that could not be unspoken, a truth that could not be buried. Somewhere in the galaxy, a child with broken visions now walked alone, guided by voices, shaped by futures not yet real. He would gather others, not Sith, not Jedi, something in between, or beyond. He would teach them what he saw. He would build something new. And though history would forget his name, the Force would not. He should have been ready by now. Other Sith apprentices his age had already tasted their first kill, already bled in the name of power, already stood in the presence of ancient holocrons and called the dead by name. But he couldn't hold the blade. Not the way Darth Cognos wanted. Not the way Darth Bane had required. Millennial's hands trembled when he gripped the hilt, not from weakness but from noise. The moment his fingers closed around it, the Force screamed. Time fractured. Futures bled through the walls of his mind, and he could see every possible outcome of every motion he might make. Strike, and she dies. Strike, and she breaks your spine. Strike, and the temple burns. Strike, and your hand is cut away. Strike, and the galaxy ends. He could not choose, so he did nothing. And Darth Cognos watched. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She only marked the hesitation, another fracture in her plan. Millennial had power. She had felt it since the moment of his birth, but power meant nothing without control. And what she saw now was disobedience, not rebellion, not refusal, but fear. He feared the wrong future, and that made him dangerous. The training accelerated. She dragged him to the lower vaults beneath the Prakith stronghold, where the air was heavy with the screams of long-dead initiates, where the floor remembered pain, and the walls whispered of betrayal. He was left there for days, alone with a blindfold, no food, no light, no sleep. And still, he whispered. The voices didn't leave him, they grew louder. He spoke of a Sith woman who would rise from the ashes of betrayal, of a Jedi child who would bring fire to the stars, of Mandalorians returning to reclaim something they had forgotten. He spoke as if reciting history from memory. Cognos returned on the 6th day. She found him kneeling, not in prayer, not in defeat, in calculation. He had drawn a map in his own blood, not of the fortress, not of the stars, a map of timelines, and at the center a single mark, his own. He looked up at her, eyes hollow. I'm not the one who breaks the rule. I'm the one who sees how it ends. She said nothing. He stood, slowly, calmly. I don't want to fight you. That was the first time he admitted it. I don't want to kill. I don't want to destroy. Cognos stepped forward. Her voice was quiet. Then you are not Sith. And she struck him. Once, a crack across the jaw that shattered 2 teeth. He didn't fall. He didn't cry out. He only closed his eyes, and the visions came again. He saw her death, not by his hand, not by a blade, but by irrelevance, by becoming the last voice of a doctrine no one would follow. And in that moment, he pitied her. Cognos saw it, the shift in his presence, the way his fear had turned inward, not away from her, but away from what she believed. He no longer feared punishment. He feared becoming like her, a loyal servant to a system already dying. The cracks deepened, and Darth Cognos understood something she never wanted to face. Millennial would never become what she needed. He was not a Sith Lord in waiting. He was a schism wrapped in flesh, and the Force would not let him rest. Not until he acted. His training continued, but the rhythm was wrong. He learned the forms. He memorized the sequences. Makashi, Juyo, even glimpses of Trakata and Dunmush. He knew how to fight, but he didn't believe in it. Every motion was measured, but not driven. Every strike ended before it landed. Not because he was weak, because he was listening to futures. The blade in his hand became a question, not a weapon. And Darth Cognos hated questions. There were rules to Sith apprenticeship. Suffering bred strength. Pain revealed truth. Kill or be replaced. But Millennial defied that rhythm. He absorbed pain without evolving. He let the Force move through him, but never commanded it. He refused to kill without purpose. And purpose, to him, no longer meant dominance. Cognos watched as he sparred with training droids. He disarmed, disabled, avoided the kill. When pressed to explain, he offered only one line. There are more powerful ways to break something than killing it. She struck him for that, and he didn't flinch. At night, she sent him visions forced into his sleep by Sith alchemy, drawn from relics buried in the dust of Ziost and Relg. They were meant to shape him, to focus him, but the boy saw through them. He told her the illusions were old, recycled echoes of pain, twisted by Sith long gone. They used fear to control their own disciples, he whispered. That's why they died screaming. Cognos said nothing. She knew he was right. But truth without obedience was dangerous. She forced a confrontation. An arena. 2 other apprentices, older, stronger, dropped into the pit without warning. One held a vibroblade, the other a training saber. Both had been taught to hate him. They had watched him be favored, protected, and now they were told, only one may walk out. Millennial didn't raise his weapon. He dodged the first strike, rolled under the second. He parried, countered, but never struck to kill. He disarmed one, broke the other's wrist, and stood over them both, breathing slowly, blade still cold. Cognos descended from the upper walkway, silent, watching. You failed. He looked up at her. They're defeated. They're alive. They don't need to die. Then you don't need to live. She raised her hand, and for the first time, he stopped listening to the voices. He acted. The floor cracked beneath her, not with force lightning, not with rage, with pressure. Sudden, deep, focused, a tremor through the stone, collapsing the arena wall. Dust filled the air. Stone buried the pit. She emerged minutes later, choking, bleeding, but alive, and alone. The apprentices were gone. So was Millennial. He had vanished into the tunnels beneath the fortress. Not out of fear, out of clarity. The blade had taught him what he needed. He would never kill because he was told to. He would never rule because he was expected to. He would become what the Sith could not understand, a blade that chose its own hand and refused the kill. Darth Cognos searched for him in silence, not with anger, not with fear, with purpose. The boy had crossed a line no apprentice was ever meant to cross. He had refused the kill. He had refused the lesson. And worst of all, he had refused her. In the rule of two, there was no crime greater than disobedience. If the apprentice would not fall into line, they would be removed. It was simple, efficient, clean. But nothing about Millennial was simple. She tracked him through the labyrinth beneath the fortress chambers carved by Sith who embraced torment, tunnels filled with dust from extinguished bloodlines, and shadows that remembered every scream that had ever echoed there. He left marks behind, not footprints, not signs of panic, lines carved into the stone, circles, numbers, patterns she didn't recognize. He was mapping something again, seeing through walls she could not perceive. Cognos paused in the dark, running her fingers over the carved symbols. They were not words, not predictions, not warnings. They were choices, possible outcomes, each one ending the same way. He lives. She does not. A rare chill slid down her spine. Cognos had faced Jedi masters, survived assassins, endured betrayals from her own peers. But this child, he saw her death as if it were a fact already locked in the marrow of time. She pressed deeper into the tunnels. The air grew cold. The stone grew older. Torches flickered as if trying to warn her. Finally, she found him, sitting on the edge of an ancient well of dark energy, staring at the water like he was looking into another life. "You ran," she said. "He didn't look up. You were going to kill me. That is the path." "No," he whispered. "It's yours." His voice didn't tremble. His hands didn't shake. He had stopped fearing her. And that was the part she could not forgive. Cognos stepped closer. Her presence filled the chamber like a closing fist. "You were chosen," she said. "Not because you are strong, but because you were meant to learn." "I did learn." "And what did you learn?" "That I'm not the apprentice you need." Silence. The torches cracked. Shadows shifted. Cognos extended her hand. A slow, deliberate gesture. She could end him now. Crush him against the stone. Break his fragile, fractured mind until he became nothing more than a memory trapped in the cracks of the fortress. But the force resisted her, not in defiance, in warning. The air vibrated with tension. The ground hummed beneath her boots. The boy still hadn't turned to face her. Instead, he spoke with a calm that felt older than he was. "You can kill me, but it won't stop what's coming." "And what is coming?" He finally looked over his shoulder, not with confidence, not with triumph, with sorrow. A path without masters. Her jaw tightened. She ignited her blade. The red glow painted the walls like a wound. The air thinned. The dust trembled. Millennial rose slowly. He didn't ignite his saber. He didn't open his stance. He only breathed. And the force surged around him, wild, chaotic, undirected, like a storm trying to escape a cage. For the first time, Cognos saw the truth. The boy wasn't resisting her teaching. He wasn't rejecting the rule. He was changing, becoming something neither Jedi nor Sith had language for. A fracture, a divergence, a prophecy that would not bend to tradition. And Darth Cognos, loyal heir to Bane's vision, felt the weight of her failure, because she knew this moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Darth Millennial was not hers to shape, and she could not stop what he was already becoming. He left before the suns rose. No confrontation, no final strike, no ceremony, just silence. One moment he was there, a trembling apprentice shaped by fear. The next, he was gone, a shadow walking into a future no one could follow. Darth Cognos stood in the ruins of the lower vaults, blade still lit, but she didn't chase him. Not because she couldn't, but because she knew this wasn't an escape. It was a beginning. Millennial had not been broken. He had chosen to become something else. Not the rule's weapon, not her legacy, a fracture, and fractures spread. He wandered alone for weeks through the broken moons of Taris, the frozen valleys of Oricon, the forgotten craters of Ambria. The force did not quiet. If anything, it grew louder. He no longer tried to silence it. He listened. He began to see the galaxy not as it was, but as it could become. A Sith order where obedience was replaced with understanding, where power was shared, not hoarded, where the future was not chained to two voices. He saw temples filled with dark adepts, each serving their own vision. He saw hierarchies collapse. He saw a church rise where a throne once stood. He saw himself, not as a Sith Lord, but as a prophet. The voices agreed. They showed him systems untouched by Jedi, worlds abandoned by both light and dark, people forgotten by power. And among them, he felt it, a hunger for purpose. They didn't want domination. They wanted direction, and he had it. He began to speak in ruined marketplaces and half-buried shrines. Small groups at first, failed Sith, discarded Force sensitives, outcasts. They listened, not because he was powerful, but because he understood them. They too had seen through the cracks in the code. They too had heard the whispers. And, in Millennial, they found something terrifying. Hope, not for peace, but for meaning. They called him the Mouth of Shadows. Some called him the Last Heir, but he chose no title. He only taught. And what he taught was heresy, not a rejection of the dark side, but a release from the cage built around it. He still remembered Cognos, her eyes, her silence, and he knew she would never forgive him. He had not only rejected her path, he had proven it could be walked away from. And if one apprentice could walk, others would follow. The future he had seen in visions was not yet here, but it was moving, quietly, inevitably. He watched the stars from the edge of a cliff on a nameless world, surrounded by those who once called themselves Sith and now wore no name at all. He spoke softly. There will be many, and the Force pulsed in response, not in agreement, not in denial, but in recognition. The rule of two had not ended, not yet, but its days were numbered, and the shadow of Darth Millennial had already begun to spread. There are places in the galaxy that even the Sith forget. Ruins so steeped in ancient darkness, not even memory dares return. Millennial found one, not through maps, not through instinct, but through the voices. They led him beyond the mid-rim, beyond the shattered worlds, to a system swallowed by starless quiet, where force nexuses bled power into the bones of dead moons. Bogan, a place not marked by the Jedi or the Sith, but by something older. A world lost to the light, not because it was destroyed, but because it had been hidden. He walked the surface in silence, feet dragging through scorched soil, past temple fragments half swallowed by time. And in one of those broken mouths of stone, he found a way down. The crypts did not welcome him. They resisted. Stone shifted unnaturally. Whispers cracked against the back of his skull. His breath shortened, though there was no air to choke. He descended anyway, because something was waiting. Not a person, not a holocron, but truth. He didn't bring a blade. He brought only a torch and the fragments of dreams he no longer understood. Each step pulled him deeper into memory, but not his own. These were thoughts carved into the very walls, preserved not by writing, but by presence. He passed Sith bones, long since drained of anger. He passed columns etched with runes that bled when touched. He passed mirrors that did not reflect him, only the version of himself he feared most. The deeper he went, the more the Force twisted. Not into clarity, into contradiction. He saw visions layered over each other like rotting cloth. Visions of what was, what might be, and what had never been allowed to happen. At the end of the descent, the crypt opened wide, a chamber older than the Sith language. Its shape was unnatural, a triangle bent inward on itself, with no clear walls, no clean corners. And at its center, a slab, plain, cracked, and upon it, scrolls. 5 of them, wrapped in ash-dried hide, sealed with a symbol he had seen only once before, in a dream that ended with his body buried beneath a pyramid of bone. He touched them, the seal broke, and the Force surged, not like lightning, not like rage, like a dam collapsing inside his soul. He did not scream. He whispered, because the moment his skin met the parchment, words bloomed in his mind, not in galactic basic, not in high Sith, but in something deeper, a language of meanings, not sentences, of consequences, not ideas. The scrolls did not speak of the Force, they showed it, not as light and dark, not as balance or destiny, but as a network, a web of connection, of voices, of futures entangled in chaos so deep that only madness could map them. And Millennial mapped them, not because he understood, because he belonged to them. He read for days. He didn't eat, didn't sleep. He transcribed their patterns into the dirt, into the walls, into his skin. And when he finally rose from the floor, he was not the same. The boy who feared vision was gone. Now he followed them, because the scrolls had shown him what the Sith had never taught. The rule of 2 was not a truth. It was a choice, and choices could be broken. The scrolls did not hold instructions. They held voices, not of Sith Lords or ancient gods, but of moments. Moments where time fractured and the Force bent itself into impossible shapes. Some called them echoes, others curses. Millennial called them visions, and they did not stop. Every night, his mind reopened, not like a door, but like a wound. He saw battles that had never been fought. He saw Jedi screaming in tongues no Jedi ever learned. He saw Sith temples made of glass, breaking under the weight of too many masters. And he saw himself. standing at the center of it all, speaking words he did not remember learning, to people who did not exist. The scrolls whispered of a concept no Sith had ever spoken aloud. Multiplicity, not of species, not of timelines, but of fate. That the Force was not linear. That the destinies of Force sensitives overlapped, conflicted, cancelled each other out. And that every great power eventually broke the chain. Millennial began to understand why Darth Bane had created the rule of two. Not to protect the Sith, but to simplify the future. One master, one apprentice, one thread. But the scrolls didn't want one. They wanted many. And through them, the Force began to speak not with warning, but with hunger. He walked Bogan's surface again, his body thin, his step slower, but his voice returned. It spoke without fear, without hesitation. He recited prophecy like it was memory, and wherever he walked, the earth reacted. Ash lifted, wind turned, and once the dead stirred beneath his feet, not rising, but remembering. He began carving the scroll's knowledge into stone, not to preserve it, to release it. Each line etched into the cliffs, the temple ruins, the bones of long-dead beasts, carrying words no living being should have understood. And still, he wrote, because the Force wasn't asking him, it was using him. He tried to resist once, just once. He held the last scroll in his lap for 3 days, refusing to open it. And for 3 nights, his body convulsed. Not from pain, from pressure. The kind that builds in a mind stretched too far. The kind that fractures identity from within. When he finally unsealed it, the pressure stopped, and the scroll whispered something different. It did not speak of fate. It spoke of a place, a temple, hidden on a world drowned in fog, a nexus point, a place where prophets had bled before him. He saw it clearly. He did not know the name, but he knew the path. He would leave Bogan behind, not because it had nothing left to give, but because it had already given too much. As he stood one final time at the crypt's mouth, he looked down at his hands. They were shaking, but not from weakness, from awareness. He had read something no apprentice was ever meant to see. Something even the greatest Sith had chosen to forget. That prophecy was not a gift. It was a virus. Once spoken, it could never be removed. And now it lived inside him, waiting to spread. He began speaking before he realized the words were leaving his mouth. Soft at first, barely sound, like whispers born from the cracks in his mind. He didn't choose the sentences. They chose him. Sometimes they came while he walked, sometimes while he slept, sometimes in the still moments between breaths, when the Force felt close enough to touch. And every time, the words felt borrowed. Not his voice, not his rhythm, not his intent. He sounded older, heavier, as if carrying memories that belonged to another age. Millennial would stop mid-sentence, startled by what he had just said. Then he would realize he was only repeating what the scrolls had shown him. Fragments of futures trying to become real. The visions did not speak in warnings. They spoke in patterns. The blade that ends one path must begin another. The apprentice who sees too far will lose what he might have been. The Sith will fracture when the voice that should not exist is finally heard. These lines spilled from his lips without emotion, without pause, without understanding. He would whisper them into the dust of abandoned ruins, into the wind rolling over Bogan's silent plains, into the empty spaces of forgotten temples, and the Force would echo back, not with words, with pressure, with presence, as if listening, As if waiting, he started noticing changes in himself. Small, quiet shifts. His eyes lingered where the Force felt tangled. His hands moved in patterns that matched the scroll's symbols. His breath slowed when he stepped into ancient chambers, syncing with energies older than the Sith language. Once, he caught his reflection in a shard of blackened glass. He didn't look frightened. He didn't look lost. He looked empty. Not hollow, not broken, just emptied out, like something had been taken, and something else had been put in its place. He wondered if this was what prophets felt like. Not chosen, not blessed, claimed. The words grew stronger when he left Bogan behind. During his travels across the Outer Rim, he walked through settlements abandoned by war, villages swallowed by dust storms, and valleys marked by long-dead rituals. People heard him before they saw him. A boy speaking prophecies no child should know. They didn't understand the language, but they felt the weight. A man once grabbed him by the arm, demanding the meaning behind a phrase Millennial had spoken only moments before. "What did you say?" the man begged. "What does it mean?" Millennial stared at him. "I don't know." The man backed away, afraid, but it wasn't fear of the boy. It was fear of the truth inside the words. Each prophecy cut deeper, not because they were violent, but because they felt inevitable. He began attracting followers without trying. A failed Sith acolyte, a woman who claimed to hear the Force only through dreams, a wanderer who had lost his family to a Jedi raid and believed destiny owed him purpose. They followed the boy, not because he commanded them, but because something in his voice sounded like certainty. He didn't want them. He didn't ask for them. But still, they came. Some thought he was a messenger. Others thought he was a curse. Millennial knew he was neither. He was only a conduit, a vessel for echoes that did not belong to him. He walked one night along a ridge overlooking a dead forest, speaking words he did not understand. The followers listened, and when he finished, one whispered, "That wasn't your voice." Millennial paused. "I know." The wind carried the last syllables away. He stared into the darkness, his heart beating softly, quietly, like it was trying to hide. Because for the first time, he realized the truth. One day, the words would replace him entirely, and the galaxy would hear a prophecy that no living being could survive. He dreamed of a pyramid built from sound. Its base was made of whispers. Its peak vanished into the sky, and inside it, voices. Not screaming, not warning, just waiting. When he woke, the vision stayed, not as memory, as direction. He didn't know where the temple was, but he could feel it, buried so deep, even the Sith had forgotten. It wasn't marked by star maps. It was buried in the Force itself, beneath the surface of worlds erased from history. He began his search in silence. He wandered planets that no longer bore names, places left behind after ancient wars. He found stone circles that no one dared disturb, broken statues of beings too old for galactic memory, and always the feeling that he was walking toward something he couldn't survive. The scrolls had told him of visions, but they had not warned him what it would cost to carry them. Each day, his body thinned, not from hunger, from surrender. He wasn't dying, but he was emptying, as if the Force was hollowing him out, making room for something larger. He started speaking less. Even his followers noticed. He would sit for hours, unmoving, eyes open but unblinking. And when he finally spoke again, his voice felt farther away. One night, a disciple asked him where they were going. Millennial looked up slowly, to the place where the Force can no longer lie. The others didn't understand, but they followed, because the closer they came to the temple, the more the Force screamed. He found it on a world forgotten even by the Jedi. The surface was covered in gray fog. The air was too still. The trees were petrified like statues of grief. But beneath the roots, it waited. The temple wasn't built. It was grown, formed from black stone that hummed with buried prophecy. Its halls slanted downward. Its silence was heavy. And inside, he found the altar. No light touched it. No breath disturbed it. He placed his hand on the surface, and he saw, not the future, all of them, all at once, Jedi armies burning. Sith Lords screaming in temples torn open by time. Children born in exile, carrying names not yet invented. Planets drifting too far from their suns. The death of the Republic, the return of empire, the fracture of identity, and beneath it all, himself, not standing, not preaching, just waiting, like the voices had waited before him, like they had chosen him only to become one of them. He collapsed, his mind overwhelmed, his thoughts pulled into a spiral of futures so vast they ceased to mean anything. Time unraveled, self unraveled, but something held him together. A single word, many. He whispered it through cracked lips, and the temple listened. The walls pulsed once, then again. The altar grew warm beneath his fingers. And for the first time in his life, Millennial didn't see the rule of two. He saw a gathering, a council, a movement, not of Sith, not of Jedi, something else. It terrified him, not because it was wrong, but because it felt inevitable. He rose, stumbled back toward the surface. The temple faded behind him, swallowed by fog. He didn't speak for days, not to his followers, not to the voices, because now he understood. He had seen too far, and there would be no turning back. The final words were spoken without rage. "You are not the heir." Darth Carganus stood motionless beneath the vaulted shadows of her fortress. Her voice did not rise. Her blade remained at her side. She didn't need violence. The words were enough. Millennial didn't answer. He stood still at the edge of the training floor, eyes distant, body still thin from exile. No fear in his face, no pleading in his breath, only acceptance, but not the kind she expected. He didn't fall to his knees. He didn't beg for another trial. He didn't demand a second chance to prove his worth. He simply turned his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. And then he spoke. "Good." Cognos narrowed her eyes, not at defiance, but at the stillness in his voice. It was not anger, it was release. She had trained him for years, hurt him, shaped him, but she had never truly held him. He was always listening to something deeper, something beneath her voice, beneath her doctrine, beneath the rule itself. And now, she could feel it. The bond between them, already thin, had finally broken. She raised her hand, not to strike, but to end. One word from her and the guards would descend. One motion and the trap would spring. He would be erased. Cleanly, quietly, the rule would endure. But the Force hesitated. Cognos felt it, a stillness, like the very air had stopped breathing. Millennial stepped back once, not in retreat, but in conclusion. "There was never only one path," he said. "You just couldn't see the others." She called him a heretic, a fragment, a false prophet shaped by madness. She told him the Sith had survived for centuries without prophets, without councils, without weakness. He smiled, a small, empty smile that did not reach his eyes. That's why they always die. And then, without fear, he turned. He walked away from the fortress. No one followed, not because they were afraid, because they didn't know what he was. He didn't belong to the rule anymore. He had stepped outside its gravity. Cognos watched from the balcony, watched the last apprentice she would ever train disappear into the mountains of Prakith. She didn't speak, didn't order pursuit, because deep down, some part of her understood. This wasn't an exile, it was a divergence, a split that would not heal, a moment in time where one truth fractured, and another was born. Millennial didn't look back, not once, because he already knew what lay behind him. A chain, a cycle, a silence dressed as structure, and ahead, possibility. He didn't carry supplies, didn't carry maps, only the scrolls and the voices. The galaxy was still vast, still waiting, and somewhere in its forgotten corners, a place would be ready to listen, not to the rule of two, but to something else, something unspoken, something unwritten. Not yet. He disappeared into the mountains without leaving a trail, not because he was hiding, because the Force itself wrapped around him, muffling his presence like a shroud. Most Sith were loud. Their anger left marks. Their ambition echoed. Even in silence, they screamed. But Millennial carried a different kind of quiet. A quiet that felt wrong. A quiet that felt alive. He walked for days through narrow ridges carved by ancient winds, through valleys where nothing grew, through canyons where the bones of old beasts lay half buried in dust. He did not rest. He did not slow. And the visions followed. Sometimes they came as flashes, a scream from a child not yet born, a planet burning centuries in the future, a throne of iron and fear encircled by shadows. Other times they came as full scenes, moments unfolding as if he were living them. He saw Sith he did not recognize. He saw Jedi standing in ruins. He saw wars fought over beliefs he had only begun to understand. Each vision chipped away a small piece of him. Not enough to break him, just enough to change him. At night, when he closed his eyes, he felt something else. Not a voice, not a presence, a weight, heavy, cold, certain. He knew what it was. Not death, expectation. The kind that presses against a person until they either collapse or become something else. Millennial sat beside a cliff one night, overlooking the ravine below. The wind howled across the rocks like an old creature mourning its final breath. He didn't flinch. He whispered a question into the dark. Why me? The Force did not answer with comfort. It answered with more silence. Silence heavier than any words. Silence that made the stars above him feel farther away. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't guidance. It was invitation. A pull toward something vast and unseen. The same quiet he had heard in the presence of the scrolls. The same hush that filled the temple of fog. The same stillness that entered his mind the moment he walked away from Cognos. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence before revelation. He slept little. He ate less. But he moved with purpose. Because the visions were no longer random. They were aligning. He began seeing symbols carved into the stones of the mountain, rough spirals, intersecting lines, shapes that mirrored the markings on his arms. Not recent, ancient, left behind by others who heard the Force speak in too many directions at once. Prophets, seers, heretics, people like him, He followed the symbols, one after another, until he reached a cave hidden behind a curtain of stone. The air inside felt wrong, thin, coiled, sharp. He stepped into the darkness slowly. At first, the cave looked empty, but as his eyes adjusted, he understood. There were carvings on every surface. Hundreds, thousands. Some were deep, carved with blades. Others were shallow, etched by shaking hands. All of them spoke one truth: the rule of two cannot hold us. Millennial pressed his palm against the wall. The stone vibrated, not with sound, with memory. He felt the despair of those who carved the first lines, the hope of those who added more, the fear of those who realized what their visions meant. They weren't trying to create a new path. They were warning of one, and Millennial understood the message too well. The future had too many voices, too many outcomes, too many destinies trying to exist at once. The Sith had chosen silence, chosen structure, chosen limitation. But the Force was not quiet. Not anymore. Millennial stepped back and inhaled slowly. Because standing in that cave, covered in echoes of forgotten prophets, he finally understood what the silence meant. It wasn't asking him to turn back. It was asking him to continue. It was asking him to break the rule. He spent 7 days in the cave, alone, unfed, unmoving, not in meditation, in transcription. The words poured from him without pause, carved into the stone, drawn in the dust, etched into the bones left behind by others who had come before. But this time, they were different. They weren't echoes. They were his. Not prophecy. Doctrine. He had never thought of himself as a teacher. He didn't crave followers, didn't desire a title, didn't want power for its own sake. But something in him had shifted since the temple. The visions had become too loud to contain, and silence, he realized, would be more dangerous than heresy. So he wrote, not a code, not commandments, a path, built from questions the Sith refused to ask. What if power could be shared? What if survival didn't require solitude? What if the darkness was not a throne, but a fire to be passed? He called it nothing, not publicly, not at first, but the walls of the cave gave it a name anyway. The rule of many. He didn't define it in opposition to the rule of two. That wasn't his goal. He wasn't trying to erase Bane. He was trying to outgrow him. Millennial believed that the dark side was not a weapon to be mastered, but a current, one that flowed through all Force sensitives, one that chose no single heir, one that whispered in thousands of minds, all at once. The Sith feared that chaos. He embraced it, because where they saw disorder, he saw adaptation. He wrote that the Force was never meant to be owned, that to try and contain it in two voices was not strength. It was fear, and fear, left unchecked, always created rot. He remembered Cognus's eyes, how they never looked beyond the next apprentice, how even she, a master shaped by Zana herself, had no answer for what came after obedience. The rule of many did not ask for loyalty, it asked for honesty. If one saw visions, they would be spoken. If one gained power, they would share it. If one fell to madness, the others would decide what came next, not through hierarchy, but through need. Millennial believed that the future of the dark side required flexibility, the ability to fragment, reform, adjust to threat, not become brittle, not snap. He knew the Jedi would call it corruption. He knew the Sith would call it treason. But in his mind, it was survival. He carved the final line at dawn, not in stone, in his skin, right beneath the collarbone, a single phrase in the tongue of the scrolls. We will not be one. The sun rose slowly over the ridge. Dust drifted in the still air, and as he stood at the cave's mouth, looking down at the empty valleys of Prakith, he felt something new. Not destiny, not clarity, readiness. He had written a path no Sith dared walk, and somewhere in the galaxy, someone would be willing to follow. He didn't spread his doctrine through conquest. There was no war, no banner, no fleet, only footsteps through forgotten places. He walked alone at first, but not for long. Others found him. Some followed the whispers, some followed the visions, some followed nothing at all, just the emptiness in themselves that seemed to echo his. He didn't ask questions when they arrived. He only watched. And when they stayed, he spoke. Not with commands, with truths. Not of destiny, but of difference. He told them what the Sith would never say. That power does not belong to the strongest. It belongs to the one who listens. And there is always more than one voice. The old Sith doctrine saw this as weakness. Millennial saw it as preparation, because the galaxy was changing. Not loudly, not quickly, but beneath the surface, in the cracks between Jedi temples and Sith tombs. Something new was forming. He built no temple. He used ruins. He built no army. He taught survivors, disgraced Sith apprentices, Force sensitives abandoned by failed cults, wanderers who dreamed of the Force but could not name it. They were not students, not warriors, not yet. They were fragments, and in Millennial's presence, the fragments began to connect. He did not teach them how to kill. He taught them how to see, through the Force, through each other, through the lies that both Jedi and Sith had repeated for centuries. He taught that the Force was not a ladder. It was a circle, ever expanding, ever bending. He taught that obedience was not strength, and isolation was not clarity. Each voice mattered. Each vision had weight. Some nights, they sat in silence beneath shattered spires, listening to Millennial whisper futures he could barely understand himself. Other nights, the group argued fiercely, passionately about what the visions meant, about what path to follow. Millennial didn't stop them. He welcomed it. Because disagreement did not weaken the rule of many, it shaped it. Slowly, the movement began to form its shape, not like the Sith, who crowned themselves, not like the Jedi, who held councils and laws. This was something looser, living. It had no name the galaxy recognized, but in time, it would be remembered as something more dangerous than a cult, a foundation. He called them seekers, not Sith, not prophets, just seekers, people who knew there was more and were willing to risk madness to find it. And though he never called himself a master, they treated him like one, because only he could see what they couldn't. Only he could carry the burden of futures. Only he had survived the silence of the cave and emerged with language. He watched them train. He watched them speak to the Force. He watched them begin to hear voices of their own. And he knew this was not an army. It was an echo. And echoes grow. Words spread. Whispers moved through shadow networks of exiled Sith and lost adepts. Some feared what he was building. Some denied it. But others came looking. The rule of two did not collapse that year. Cognos trained another, and another after that. The Sith line continued, but something had changed. The galaxy now held another path, buried, quiet, alive. Millennial stood once more beneath a ruined archway as night fell. The stars above him shimmered. He looked at the faces gathered before him, tired, broken, hungry for more. And he said the words again, the same words he had carved long ago. "We will not be one." The wind carried the phrase into the dark, not as defiance, as a beginning. He left Prakith under clouded skies. No ship, no allies, no direction, just a name whispered by the Force. Korriban, not as a destination, as a wound. It was not the first time he had heard it. Every vision since the cave had ended there, among the graves of the old Sith, beneath the dust of empires long dead. He didn't rush. Pilgrims don't run. They endure. He passed through decaying ports on the mid-rim, walking among spice haulers and hollow-eyed mercenaries. He spoke only when needed, listened when no one else could hear. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse in the Force pulling him deeper inward, deeper backward, into places most Force sensitives avoided. He passed temples half swallowed by sandstorms, caves humming with barely contained energy, ruined strongholds where fallen Sith had once declared themselves gods. And, through it all, the voices followed, not louder, more focused. Each whisper echoed in the language of the scrolls. Not instructions, confirmations. He was not the first to walk this path, but he might be the last. By the time he reached the outer systems near Horaset, his presence in the Force had changed. It no longer flickered. It hummed, low, unstable, but constant, like something between silence and speech. The people who crossed his path began to notice. A trader offered him free passage through a checkpoint without explanation. A former assassin bowed as he passed, though she had never seen his face. A bounty hunter hired to kill a rogue acolyte stopped in his tracks and left without drawing his blaster. No one remembered his name, but all of them remembered something else. That, when he passed, the air grew heavier, and the future grew closer. He arrived on Korriban without ceremony. No ship greeted him. No blade tried to stop him. The planet remembered what others had forgotten. The sand was dry, the wind bitter, the tombs, half buried, still alive. He did not enter the grand crypts. Not yet. He walked between them, feet brushing against bones, long turned to dust, eyes scanning the horizon like he expected something to rise. But nothing rose, not yet. He was not here for power. He was here for memory, to understand what the Sith had buried and what they had feared to remember. He found his shelter in the broken vestibule of a fallen academy, a place once filled with screams and teachings and blind ambition. Now only silence remained. He sat in the rubble, not to rest, to listen, and the Force answered, not with visions this time, but with visitors. They came slowly at first. 1, then 3, then 7. Wanderers, outcasts, failed acolytes who had once believed they were chosen, only to be cast aside by masters too cruel to explain why. They didn't follow him. Not yet. They watched. They asked no questions. He gave no speeches. But they stayed, because something in him looked like them. Something broken, something haunted, and something that still believed there was more. They called him the Pilgrim, a name born not from reverence, but recognition. He wasn't building a movement. Not here, not yet, but a fracture had begun to widen. And in the red light of Korriban's dead sky, a shadow took shape behind him. Not a throne, not a temple, just the shape of a question the galaxy had forgotten how to ask. What if power did not require order? Korriban did not reject him. It waited. The air never warmed. The wind never softened. But the tombs opened, not with ceremony, with silence. He didn't ask permission. He entered the ruins the way an old spirit returns to the place it died. Not curious, certain. Inside, he found nothing living, only remains. Sarcophagi cracked open by time. Wall carvings eroded by centuries of forgetting. Whispers etched in stone, half swallowed by dust. But the force was still here, and it remembered. When he placed his palm against the sealed door of the Valley of the Dark Lords, the stone did not resist. It shifted, heavy, tired, like it had been waiting for someone to return. Not a Sith Lord, not a master, a listener. He walked past the resting places of Marka Ragnos, Tulak Horde, Ajunta Pol. He did not bow, did not speak their names. He knew better. These were not gods, not to him. They were warnings. Each one had ruled, each one had fallen, each one had believed themselves immortal. But the ruins told a different story. And Millennial listened. He touched the walls of the inner sanctum, cold, uneven. He felt a tremor behind his eyes, and the visions returned, not of futures, of failures. He saw the final moments of Sith legacies, castles imploding under betrayal, disciples consumed by hunger, masters who died alone in rooms full of gold. The Force didn't show him conquest. It showed him consequence. He stayed in the tomb for 3 days. The others didn't follow. They waited outside. Some thought he was meditating. But inside, Millennial was confronting something deeper than history. He was witnessing the price of power hoarded for too long. On the second night, he carved a line into the stone above one of the archways. They did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were alone. It wasn't meant to dishonor the dead. It was meant to remember them clearly. On the 4th day, he emerged, dust-covered, eyes hollow, but mind sharp. He did not speak of what he saw, but the next day, he began to teach. Not lessons, not commands, reflections. He sat among the ruins and told stories that didn't sound like prophecy. He asked questions no Sith had ever dared answer. What if power was meant to be shared? What if legacy is just another kind of chain? What if the darkness we carry isn't a weapon, but a mirror? The acolytes listened, not because they agreed, but because he was the first to ask. They began exploring ruins on their own, mapping tunnels, reclaiming old texts, reading aloud to one another beneath torchlight. Some nights, they argued, voices rising against the shadows. Millennial welcomed it, because disagreement wasn't weakness. It was proof the silence had finally broken. He told them to stop searching for masters, and start listening to the places the masters had abandoned, because the truth was still there, buried, breathing, and waiting for someone unafraid to speak its name. One dusk, a young acolyte stood and asked a question. What should we call this? Millennial didn't answer. He only pointed toward the tomb, toward the ruin that remembered everything. And then he whispered, "Not yet, because names have power." And this one wasn't ready. But deep in the earth beneath their feet, beneath the forgotten teachings and shattered doctrines, the rule of many had already begun to take shape. They came in small groups, never all at once, never for the same reason. Some were Sith, discarded by masters who saw no use in healing broken minds. Others were dreamers, force sensitives who had wandered too far from safety. drawn by stories that should have been lies. They were wounded, not just in body. Some carried guilt for what they'd done. Others carried rage for what had been taken from them. A few carried nothing at all, just silence. Millennial welcomed them without ritual. He asked no oaths. He offered no rank, only a fire and a place to sit beside it. He didn't lead. He listened. And in that stillness, something began to form between them. Not loyalty, not obedience, recognition. They were all running from something the galaxy had told them to accept. And here, among the broken statues and the whispers of the dead, they had found someone who had already stopped running. He gave them questions, never answers. He told them that the rule of two had worked, until it didn't. That the Jedi code had kept peace, until it failed. And that truth could not be held in one hand alone. They spoke long into the night, argued, debated. Some still clung to the ways they had been taught. One refused to stop calling him master. Another tried to convince the group that the Jedi had been right all along. One even threatened to leave when Millennial spoke against the doctrine of dominion. But still, they returned to the fire, because no one else in the galaxy was having these conversations, because no other place made room for contradiction. He called them the broken chain, not as insult, as origin, because every one of them had been shaped by systems that demanded silence, and every one of them had chosen to speak again. Not all stayed. Some wandered too far into the dark and were lost. Some sought their own answers and never returned. A few tried to take what they'd learned and wield it like the Sith before them. Millennial didn't stop them, because belief meant nothing without freedom, and freedom meant accepting fracture. He told them the truth. There will be those who twist what we're building, those who try to turn it into another pyramid, another throne, another lie. He didn't promise to stop them. He only promised to leave behind enough clarity that someone else might correct the course. They trained in ruins, not with blades but with questions. They practiced stillness, learned to listen, began to feel the Force not as command, but as conversation. They weren't an order. They were a reflection, the faithful and the fractured. Some believed in him, some didn't, but all believed in the possibility he carried. That power didn't need to rule. That prophecy didn't need to end in war. That voices didn't need to be silenced to be heard. One night, the wind howled across the cliffs, and a boy no older than 15 asked, "Are we Sith?" Millennial stared at the stars for a long time before answering, "No." "Then what are we?" He looked toward the fire, where two former rivals were speaking softly, where a girl who once feared her own visions was laughing for the first time in years. And he said, "We're the part they tried to forget." It happened on a night without wind. The fires burned low, the ruins stood silent, and the sky above Korriban glowed a faint, unnatural red, as if the planet itself remembered something it had tried to forget. Millennial stood alone at the center of the old courtyard, surrounded by broken pillars and the ghost of an academy that had once forged monsters. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't teaching. He was waiting. The others sensed it before he did. A shift in the Force, subtle, heavy, like a hand pressing gently on the back of every mind. One by one, they emerged from the shadows. Acolytes with cracked kybers hanging from their belts. Seers who had lost their visions but not their faith. Failed apprentices who had once dreamed of thrones, and now dreamed only of meaning. They formed a circle around him, not out of discipline, but instinct. The Force was aligning, pulling them together, drawing them toward a moment none of them were ready to understand. Millennial lifted his gaze, the air thickened, and in the space between breaths, he felt the scrolls speaking again. Not in words, in direction. He knelt in the dust, not to pray, to mark. He drew a line with his finger, slow, careful, certain, a perfect curve. The others watched, silent, still. He drew the second curve, then the third, then the fourth, until the shape was complete. A circle, simple, fragile, but humming with something the planet recognized. The first acolyte stepped closer. What does it mean? Millennial didn't answer. He placed his palm in the center of the circle. The dust warmed beneath his touch. The Force stirred. He felt it. Not destiny, not prophecy, connection. A link between the fractured minds around him. A bond forming not through hierarchy, but through shared fracture. This was not the rule of many. Not yet. This was its birth. A girl who once feared her own visions stepped into the circle first. She placed her hand beside his. A former Sith acolyte followed next. Then a wanderer from Dantooine. Then the boy who had asked if they were Sith. Then a soldier who had abandoned her battalion after seeing her commander fall into madness. One by one, they filled the circle, not standing above one another, not kneeling beneath anyone, equal. The Force reacted, a pulse, soft at first, then stronger, like a heart learning to beat for the first time. The red glow in the sky flickered. The stones beneath their feet trembled. The air vibrated as if the ancient spirits of Korriban were watching and judging. Millennial lowered his head. He felt the presence of many futures colliding. Some bright, some broken, some drenched in blood, but all of them, every single one, shaped by the circle forming around him. He spoke quietly. Power is not meant to be carried alone. The wind responded with a low, hollow moan. He continued, if one voice breaks, another speaks. The others leaned in. And if one path fails, another opens. The circle deepened. Not physically, through intention, through belief. For the first time, Millennial felt something he hadn't known since childhood. He wasn't alone in the visions. The Force wasn't whispering to him. It was whispering through them. The first red circle had been drawn, not as symbol, but as truth. A moment in history where a new doctrine found its heartbeat. Not on a throne, not in a temple, in ruin, among the discarded, the forgotten, the fractured. And as the night deepened, the circle hummed softly, as if promising the galaxy that this beginning would not be erased. He never called himself a prophet. Not once. He had no title, no doctrine, no crown. But by then, it didn't matter, because belief had already found him. It began in whispers, fragments, stories carried across the outer rim by wanderers who spoke in half-truths and contradiction. They said there was a man who spoke the future in riddles, a heretic who called the Force by name, not as energy, but as fate. They didn't know what to make of him, but they couldn't look away. He didn't demand faith, but he didn't refuse it either. And that was what made him dangerous. The rule of many had not been written in temples. It had not been forged in war. It had been born in silence, shaped by fracture, and whispered through the mouths of those who had nothing left to lose. Now, those whispers had weight. The people who arrived on Korriban were no longer just acolytes. They were pilgrims, and they came not for training, but for answers. not answers to the galaxy's great conflicts, but to their own. Millennial met them without judgment. He spoke softly, rarely, sometimes not at all, but when he did, his words didn't sound like instruction. They sounded like memory, and to those who listened long enough, they became something more. Scripture. It didn't happen all at once, but it began with a single phrase, one he had spoken months before, beside the fire, in the red circle. If one voice breaks, another speaks. Someone repeated it, then someone wrote it, then someone carved it into the wall of the old academy ruins. And from that moment on, his words were no longer just teachings. They were proof that someone had survived the visions, that someone could live with prophecy and not be destroyed by it. For the lost, that was more powerful than any throne. They began to name him, not as a Sith, not as a leader, as a symbol, the voice who endured, the mouth of many, the living path. He did not stop them, because he understood what they were really trying to say. They didn't believe in him, they believed through him. They needed someone to carry the weight of prophecy, so they could carry themselves again. And he did, quietly, even as it tore him apart. Because the futures had not left him, the visions still came, stronger, sharper, but now they came with expectation. He was no longer just a vessel. He was becoming a mirror, reflecting the hopes of every broken seeker who saw their own pain in his eyes. He didn't argue, didn't push them away, but alone, at night, he began to write again. Not doctrine, not orders, just thoughts, scattered, frightening, real. He knew what was happening. A religion was forming, and it had chosen him as its center. He had not wanted this, but now it was too late. Because when belief takes root in suffering, it grows quickly. And what began as quiet questions in ruins was becoming something far more powerful. A faith, one born not from conquest, but from ruin. And in that ruin, a single truth now echoed through the stars. Fate had a name, and it was Darth Millennial. The first scripture wasn't written by Millennial. It was written by those who misunderstood him, and those who understood him too well. At night, when the fires dimmed and the ruined academy grew quiet, pilgrims gathered in small circles. They whispered the things he had said, half remembered, half invented, but always repeated with the weight of truth. A girl who once feared her own visions recited his warning. The Force does not choose one, it chooses many. Others wrote it down. Some carved it onto stone. Some etched it into rusted metal scraps. Some burned it into leather strips worn around their arms. No one questioned if he meant it literally. They needed to believe it. So they did. More sayings followed. Riddles he had spoken absent-mindedly during his wanderings. Phrases formed during moments of quiet reflection. Words muttered in his sleep when prophecy pressed too hard against his mind. None were meant to be commandments, but the pilgrims treated them like they were. One devoted seeker wrote, "Where there is silence, listen twice." Another wrote, "Fear divides the path. Vision connects it." Another repeated a line he had spoken only once. "The future does not arrive. It accumulates." The words spread faster than Millennial realized. He didn't know that his quiet thoughts had become teachings. He didn't see how the pilgrims copied his phrases onto cloth, or how they shared them with new wanderers arriving each week. He only felt the shift, a pressure building around him, not from the Force, but from expectation. One evening, as he walked through the remains of an old Sith shrine, he found a stone covered in writing. Dozens of phrases layered over one another. The handwriting clumsy, desperate, sincere. Every line was something he had once said, some accurate, some distorted, some he didn't remember saying at all. He touched the stone. It hummed, not with power, but with belief. And belief is heavier than prophecy. A young pilgrim approached him slowly. "Do you approve?" she asked. Millennial didn't answer, because the truth was harder to carry than she could understand. He did not want scripture. Scripture made things solid, permanent, unchangeable. Scripture was another chain, and chains were what the rule of many was meant to break. But he also knew the pilgrims needed structure. They needed something to hold, something to recite when visions overwhelmed them, something to calm the chaos inside their minds. Millennial had survived that chaos alone. He didn't want anyone else to. So he didn't erase the writings. He didn't forbid them. He simply said, "Do not mistake clarity for truth." Some wrote that down, too. His words grew heavier, not because they came from him, but because people had begun to carry them like armor. Scripture turned into ritual. Ritual turned into identity. They began gathering at dawn to speak his phrases aloud. They lit fires at sunset in the red circle, reading his lines as if calling the Force itself to witness their unity. Millennial watched from a distance, not proud, not afraid, just aware. He knew where this path led, not toward freedom, toward faith. And faith, left unchecked, becomes hunger. But he didn't stop them, because they were not worshipping him. They were worshipping possibility. They were worshipping the idea that prophecy did not have to be endured alone, that the future, no matter how fractured, could be shaped by more than one hand. And as the stars shifted overhead, he finally understood why the scrolls had chosen him. Not to lead, not to rule, but to speak, because in a galaxy full of silent ruins, his voice had become a place where others could breathe again. And so the scriptures continued to grow, whether he wanted them or not. They started calling him Darth Millennial, long before he accepted it. The name rose from the mouths of those who had never known the rule of two, from seekers who had never heard of Bane, and would never kneel before a master. They didn't speak the name with fear, they spoke it with reverence, not because he ruled them, but because he understood them. He had walked alone through visions that would have shattered others. He had survived exile without bitterness. He had spoken truths that no Sith dared voice. And for that, they crowned him, not with ceremony, with belief. He did not correct them, because correcting them would have meant denying the thing he feared most. That maybe they were right. That maybe the voices hadn't followed him. Maybe they had chosen him, not as a leader, but as a symbol. He didn't wear robes, didn't carry a scepter, but still, they followed. From Nar Shaddaa came the silent ones, Force-sensitive street children who dreamt in other people's memories. From Malakor's edges came the broken, former Sith acolytes whose minds had unraveled during dark rituals, yet still clung to the fragments of something more. From the unknown regions came the curious, wanderers with no allegiance, drawn by the quiet hum of prophecy too old to trace. They didn't all agree. Some argued doctrine, some pushed for hierarchy, some wanted temples, but all of them remained, because the one thing they shared was this. They believed the Force had stopped speaking to the galaxy, and started speaking through him. It frightened Millennial, not because of what they saw in him, because of what he saw in them. He saw futures forming in the way they moved. He saw death, resurrection, fragmentation. He saw his teachings twisted, his warnings weaponized. He saw his name used to justify things he would never condone. But when he tried to speak against it, they only listened harder, as if every word, even his doubts, were part of a greater design. And maybe they were. One night, a young man approached him alone, a former slave, quiet, watchful. He sat beside Millennial beneath a crumbling statue. "I used to pray," he said, "to the stars, to the Jedi, to anything." He looked down at his hands. No one ever answered. Then he turned to him. "But you do." Millennial didn't respond. Because how do you explain to someone that you are not a god? That you're just a voice, fragile, human, tired, trying not to drown in the weight of futures too vast to name? He didn't say it. He just nodded. The boy bowed and left. The next morning, that same boy led a group in meditation. He quoted something Millennial had said months earlier. A quiet musing, spoken more to himself than to anyone else. When the Force speaks in too many voices, it's because it wants to be heard. The boy spoke it like it was scripture, and in that moment, Millennial realized something final. He had not created a movement. They had. He had only stood still long enough for others to build one around him. And now it was too late to stop it. He wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't just a heretic. He was their prophet. Not because he asked to be, because they needed him to be. And the Force, whether it agreed or not, did not say otherwise. It didn't begin with a temple. It began with a gathering. No banners, no chants, just silence and eyes that had seen too much. They came from every edge of the Outer Rim. Worlds where the Jedi had never touched. Ruins where Sith Lords had once fallen. Not to conquer, not to kneel, but to witness. The name came from them, the Dark Force Church. 3 words, spoken first in jest, then in defiance, then in reverence. At first, Millennial resisted it. Church implied worship, and worship demanded blindness. But the term endured, not because it was perfect, but because it described something they could finally explain. Not a cult, not a rebellion, a faith, a living structure built not around obedience, but observation. They believed the Force was not just an energy, it was a will, and that will had chosen to fracture itself, to speak through thousands rather than one. And they believed that fracture had a shape, a pattern, and a name, Darth Millennial. He wasn't at the center. He was the beginning, the first voice to survive prophecy without losing himself to it. He didn't declare doctrine. He didn't crown himself, but they did it for him. They recorded his sayings not as rules, but as cycles, moments to be returned to, reflections to be revisited. They gathered every week in the ruins of the Red Circle. They recited his words not like commands, but like coordinates, trying to find their own way through the dark. And slowly, the church grew, from a few dozen to hundreds. Then whispers reached other systems, small moons, mining colonies, Force cults left behind after the old Sith Wars. They heard the rumors, a man who didn't promise salvation, only understanding. They came to see for themselves. Most stayed, some left. All of them carried the same feeling when they returned to their worlds, that something was changing, not loudly, but permanently. He still didn't call himself a leader. He sat at the edge of each gathering, silent, watching them speak to each other. The church didn't need his approval. It only needed his presence. He was living proof that the Force could be survived. That prophecy didn't have to end in madness. That vision didn't have to be isolation. He didn't build a temple, but they did. Not on Korriban. That ground was sacred to their silence. They built it on a quiet moon, far from trade routes, hidden in shadow. A place where the Force pulsed, but did not scream. A sanctuary for those who had seen too much. They shaped it with stone, no gold, no thrones, just chambers for listening, and a single chamber for remembering, not for worship, for reflection. In its center, they placed a stone etched with his first words, "We will not be one." Millennial never touched the stone. He stood before it only once, and whispered, "Let this never become a throne." The others heard him. They didn't cheer, they didn't bow, they just stood beside him in the silence. Because they understood, the church wasn't about him. It was about what he had survived, what he had seen, and what they would now carry forward. Together, the galaxy would ignore them for a time. The Sith would deny their existence. The Jedi would dismiss them as broken heretics. But in the dark corners of the Force, beneath the bones of old temples, the church would grow, and its first truth would echo forever. That fate was real, that the Force could speak, and that sometimes it chose a prophet not to be worshipped, but to remind the galaxy that silence was never neutral. The visions never stopped, even as the church grew, even as pilgrims gathered to speak his words, even as his name was carried from one forgotten world to the next. The visions stayed, and they changed. They grew darker, sharper, more violent. What once came in symbols and fragments now came in images so vivid he woke from sleep with blood in his mouth. He saw cities crumbling beneath invisible fire. He saw Jedi armies slaughtered by soldiers who wore no symbols. He saw fleets of metal drifting through black skies, unmanned, directionless, but still killing. He saw the Force collapse into silence. He no longer heard voices. He heard voids, gaps where destiny used to be. The others didn't notice. Not at first. They thought his silence meant peace, that his long stares into the sky meant he was listening, that his quiet during their gatherings meant agreement. But they didn't see his hands shaking beneath the robes. They didn't see the blood on his teeth in the mornings. They didn't see the tears on his face when no one was watching. The Force had shown him what came next, and it was worse than death. It was disappearance. Not just for him, for everything. There was a pattern he couldn't unsee, a shape forming across every possible timeline he touched. Something collapsing from within, not because of failure, but because of momentum, as if the galaxy had been pushed down a path so narrow. There was no room left to turn, and every version of the future ended the same way, with him gone. Not killed, not defeated, just missing, as if he had never been there. He searched the visions for exceptions, alternate endings, other echoes of himself in the fractures, but every time he tried to step beyond that vanishing point, the Force stopped speaking. It gave him everything up to that moment, and then nothing. He tried to warn them. He told his closest followers in the Red Circle that the visions had changed, that the timelines no longer reached him, that something was coming. But they didn't hear what he was trying to say. They only heard fear. And in fear, they found belief. They thought it was another trial, a metaphor, a prophecy still unfolding. But to Millennial, it was neither. It was a warning. A final truth. He had seen the galaxy's end, and it wasn't war. It wasn't death. It was forgetting, a slow erasure of memory, of meaning, of voice. He was becoming a myth inside his own lifetime. He would speak, and the words would echo, but no one would remember who first said them. He would write, but the writing would be buried beneath 1,000 interpretations. He would live, but history would stop including him. And he didn't know if the Force had planned it that way, or if he had. He spent more time alone after that, walking through ruins in silence, sitting beside the stone where his first phrase had been carved. "We will not be one." It sounded different now, not defiant, but sad, because the Force had spoken, and in its countless branches and futures and endings, he was already gone. The visions changed again. This time, they didn't show him symbols. They showed him stars, burning, dying, collapsing under the weight of choices made in other lifetimes. He saw wars, but not the ones he knew. Not Jedi against Sith. Not Republic against Empire. These wars had no banners, no codes, no names. Only destruction. He saw ships the size of cities, not commanded by people, but by intention. Weapons guided by echoes in the Force. Constructs powered by hunger, not belief. He saw planets scarred by ritual, not battle. Worlds where the Force no longer flowed, where it had been removed. He saw beings who moved through space, like gravity meant nothing, who spoke no words, but left ruin in their wake. And above them all, emptiness. The Force didn't cry out. It watched. He couldn't tell where these futures came from. Some felt thousands of years away. Others felt close enough to touch. But they all ended the same. Not in victory. In silence. He tried to understand, tried to trace the origin of what he saw. Was it the Jedi, the Sith, the heresies he himself had planted? But every path he followed through the Force curved back on itself, as if the beginning had been forgotten, as if the galaxy was no longer walking forward, but falling. One vision showed him a Jedi holding a crimson blade. Another showed a Sith burning their own temple to prevent a prophecy from escaping. Another showed a child, standing alone, watching stars die one by one with no emotion on their face. The faces changed, the factions disappeared, but the war continued, and it reached beyond the stars, beyond the Force. He stopped meditating, because the deeper he reached, the more fragmented the visions became. He stopped speaking about them, because even those closest to him couldn't hear what he was trying to say. They still believed in purpose. He had seen purpose dissolve. They still believed in a cycle. He had seen the cycle break, not shattered by rebellion, but by apathy, by forgetting. He saw empires built by memory, replaced by empires built by survival, and then replaced again by nothing at all. He began walking farther from the church. He needed distance, not from the people, from the weight, because every time he looked into the Force now, he saw pieces of himself, drifting, as if he had been scattered across futures that no longer included him. He asked the Force, once in the dark, "Why show me what I cannot change?" The Force did not answer, not in language, not in feeling, only in vision. One last future, one last war, a battlefield with no sky, armies made of shadow, and in the center, a throne no one sat on, empty, waiting. He understood then. This wasn't just prophecy. This was grief. The Force wasn't warning him. It was mourning him, and mourning itself, because what was coming, what had already begun, would not destroy the galaxy by fire. It would consume it by forgetting what light and dark even meant. Millennial returned to the stone that bore his first words. He stared at them for hours. We will not be one. But in the futures he now saw, there would be no many, no one, no voice, no name, only stars burning out in silence. The visions shifted again. This time, they did not show battles or broken galaxies. They showed a single life. Small, fragile, wrapped in shadow. A child, born in chains. The image appeared so suddenly that Millennial staggered, gripping the edge of an old stone pillar as the vision forced itself into his mind. He saw a boy growing up in silence. He saw fear woven into his bones. He saw a heart shaped not by love, but by captivity. The force pressed tighter. Millennial saw the boy become a slave. He saw him endure humiliation, hunger, and isolation. He saw hands too small for violence learn to build machines, and dreams too large for a cage begin to form. He saw anger, not loud, not wild, quiet anger, the kind that waits, the kind that burns without light. The child grew older, and the visions sharpened. The boy met a Jedi, a woman with calm eyes and a wounded spirit. For a moment, the future brightened, but then it twisted. Millennial tried to pull back, but the Force dragged him deeper. He saw the Jedi kneeling, hurt, conflicted. He saw the boy's fear turn into devotion. He saw that devotion turn into desperation. He saw chains, not physical ones, but emotional. And then, choice. A terrible, galaxy-breaking choice. The child was no longer a child. He was older now, stronger, shaped by things he never asked for. And in the center of every future Millennial touched, this boy stood like a fracture in time. Sometimes he wore Jedi robes, sometimes black armor, sometimes he stood alone, drowned in the weight of impossible expectations. Sometimes he fell, sometimes he burned, sometimes he rose, but in every version, he changed everything. Millennial whispered into the empty air, "You are the one." The Force trembled. He saw a blade, red, then blue, then red again. He saw temples burning under his scream. He saw starfleets kneeling in his shadow, and then collapsing in his grief. He saw the galaxy reshape itself around him. But most terrifying of all, he saw how this future ended. Not with the boy's death, not with victory, with redemption. Redemption so sudden, so powerful, it bent the Force around it like a star collapsing into itself. Millennial fell to his knees. This chosen one, born in chains, was not a Sith's triumph, not a Jedi's rescue, not a prophecy to be claimed. He was a correction, a wound the Force was trying to heal, but the healing would demand unimaginable loss. Millennial saw the boy's face, older now, broken, eyes filled with a grief that carried 1,000 ruined futures. He saw him kneel in fire. He saw him rise in light. He saw him die in darkness. He saw him live long enough to destroy the future itself. And then the Force went silent. The vision ended. Millennial gasped, trembling, hands pressed into the stone as if trying to hold himself together. He whispered the truth he wished he hadn't seen. He is the galaxy's fate, not me. The pilgrims found him hours later, sitting alone, eyes hollow, breath shallow. They asked what he had seen. He did not answer, because he knew they wouldn't understand. He wasn't the center of the prophecy. He wasn't the savior, or the destroyer, or the voice that would guide the galaxy. He was only the reminder, a fragment, a warning, A prophet whose visions pointed not toward himself, but toward a child who would one day be born into chains. A child who would carry the future in his hands and crush it. He began to forget the sound of his own voice. Not because he stopped speaking, because fewer people were listening. The church still gathered. The red circle still burned. Scripture was still recited in distant corners of forgotten worlds. But he could feel it. The distance. Not between himself and the people. Between himself and time. He was still alive. Still walking. Still witnessing. But the galaxy had already begun to look past him. The new pilgrims no longer asked him questions. They asked the elders, the scribes, the ones who had heard him speak 10 years ago, but remembered it as myth. His words were still quoted, but not as thoughts, as artifacts. Lines chiseled into temple stones, spoken not for meaning, but for rhythm. Ritual had swallowed relevance. The dark force church had become what he feared most. Unchanging, not static in form, static in memory. He read one of their books once, a volume titled The 9 Eyes of the Prophet. He had never said any of it. Not the lessons, not the poems, not the chants, but no one questioned it, because the church no longer needed him. Only the idea of him, a shape, a name, a symbol, the man behind it, the broken boy from Prakith, the child who saw too many futures, had already been replaced. He didn't fight it. He walked farther each day, longer stretches into silence, colder moons, quieter caves. He watched the stars, not to find answers, just to remember they were still there. One night, alone in the canyons of a forgotten world, he whispered into the Force, "Let me vanish before they finish writing who I was." He didn't want a statue. He didn't want another volume. He didn't want the Force to carry his name past its meaning. He wanted stillness, not peace, stillness, the kind that comes when a voice finishes speaking and no echo follows. He returned to Korriban for the last time, not to teach, not to gather, to bury something. No one followed. They didn't know he had left. And if they did, they didn't ask why. He knelt in the sand beside the first stone, the one where it all began. "We will not be one." He stared at the words for a long time. They didn't feel like his anymore. They felt like the galaxy's. And maybe that was the point. He placed a scroll beneath the stone, not to preserve knowledge, to let it go. Inside were the visions he never shared, the ones too dark, too uncertain, too heavy. He had seen how it ended, not with fire, not with triumph, with erasure. His own name, lost between 2 centuries of louder voices. The Jedi would not remember him. The Sith would not claim him. The Church would rewrite him. And history would move forward, without ever knowing the fracture he once was. He closed his eyes. He did not pray. He did not plead. He only asked the Force for one final grace. Let him be forgotten with purpose, not erased by ignorance, but released with intention. Because not every prophecy ends in revelation. Some end in silence. He stood. No farewell, no monument. Just footsteps in dust, slowly fading behind him. And as the wind swept over the valley, the prophet disappeared. Not in death, in memory. He should have seen it coming. Not through prophecy, not through vision, but through silence. The same silence that once welcomed him, that once made him feel chosen, had changed. It was quieter now, colder, sharp around the edges. His followers still gathered. They still lit the fires. They still spoke his words. But the way they looked at him was different. It wasn't reverence. It wasn't doubt. It was calculation. As if they were no longer waiting for him to speak. They were waiting for him to fall. It didn't happen all at once. The fractures started small. A seeker began teaching his own interpretation of the rule of many. He said obedience was not just a chain, but a disease. He said prophecy was a tool, and Millennial was only the first to wield it, not the last. Another questioned the circle, claimed it was a prison, said unity had become hierarchy. That doctrine, once fluid, had begun to rot. Millennial listened. At first, he welcomed it. Debate was part of the vision. Disagreement was healthy. They were not Sith. They were seekers, but then came the whispers. Some said he was no longer speaking to the Force, that the visions had left him, that the prophet had gone blind. Others claimed he had never seen anything at all, that the scrolls had broken his mind, that the church was built on delusion, that the galaxy was still waiting for someone real. He didn't respond, not because he was afraid, because he wasn't surprised. He had felt it coming for years. The way scripture replaced memory, the way ritual replaced reflection. He had felt himself fading from their story, and now they were rewriting it without him. One of his earliest followers, a woman he once trusted, spoke openly in the outer circles. "He is the past," she said. "His voice brought us here, but his silence cannot lead us forward." She wasn't cruel. She wasn't angry. She was certain. And that was what hurt the most. They were not betraying him in anger. They were betraying him in belief. They believed the church needed something more, something louder, something that didn't look so tired. He had taught them to question doctrine. Now they questioned him. He remembered the night the girl carved his words into stone. "We will not be one." It had meant unity. Now it meant division. Every circle had its own teachings. Every teacher had their own truth. And in the center of it all, he stood alone, watching a doctrine once built to prevent control begin to devour itself. They still called it the rule of many, but the meaning had changed. It no longer meant many voices working together. It meant many doctrines, many truths, many rivals. The Force no longer whispered to him. It watched him, like it too was waiting to see what would happen when a prophet's voice was no longer needed and belief turned inward, searching for a new truth to worship. He walked the edge of the red circle one evening, long after the fires had burned down. He stared at the stone. His first words, they hadn't changed, but the people around them had. He knelt there for a long time, and he knew it wasn't prophecy that would destroy the rule of many. It was ambition, and ambition had already chosen its next voice. It happened without warning, but not without reason. The fractures had grown deep, the questions had sharpened, and now 3 voices had decided to answer them, not with words, but with silence. Permanent silence. The plan was simple. Strike before dawn, while the church slept, while the prophet dreamed. One of them knew the pattern of his breath. Another had memorized the creak of his steps on stone. The third had waited months for the right night, when the winds would be loud enough to cover footsteps. They didn't call it assassination. They called it release. They believed the rule of many had outgrown its creator. That Millennial's mind had become too clouded by futures. That his silence was no longer mystery, but weakness. They believed he had become a blockage, a shadow standing between them and the next phase. So they became shadows themselves. 3 disciples, each one hand-picked by Millennial in the early days. Each one trusted, each one shaped by his words. Now they walked through the stone halls of the ruined temple, with blades hidden beneath cloaks. No colors, no symbols, only intent. The first to enter his chamber was the closest to him once. She hesitated, for only a moment, then stepped forward. Millennial was awake, sitting, not startled, not afraid, waiting. She froze. The second entered behind her, fist wrapped around a jagged hilt, eyes already trembling. The third stepped in last. No blade, just silence. He had come not to kill, but to watch. Millennial spoke softly. I saw this. No one moved. The chamber was dark, lit only by the pale glow of the stars above. He didn't rise. He didn't resist. I don't fear you, he said, but you should fear what comes after. The first stepped forward. Your visions are gone, she said. Then why are you here? He asked. She didn't answer, because part of her still believed. The second raised his blade, but his hand shook. Without you, he said, the church will grow. Millennial nodded. That is the problem. The blade came down, but it never reached him. The third disciple, the one who had come to watch, moved. Fast, silent, precise. The second fell first. No scream, just a choked gasp. Then stillness. The first turned in panic, her blade half drawn. She never finished the motion. And then there were 2. Millennial and the last one standing. The one who had once called him lost. Who had once questioned if prophecy had a place in the future. He knelt, not in loyalty, in recognition. They were wrong, he said, but so were you. Millennial looked at the blood on the floor, then at the faces he had once trusted. He didn't cry, didn't tremble. He only whispered, "This is how Doctrine dies." The survivor nodded, "And how it's born again." The stars above blinked. The night moved on. The bodies were buried. The temple was silent. No stories were told. The church awoke the next morning, as if nothing had happened. No bells, no trials, no judgment. But from that day forward, the fire at the center of the red circle burned a little colder. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone knew. The prophet had been attacked by his own, and only one shadow walked away. They never spoke of the attack. Not in public, not in whispers, not even in prayer. The church moved forward, as if 3 voices hadn't vanished in the same night. But the silence said enough. Something had broken, not just in the prophet, in the doctrine itself. Before, the rule of many had been fluid, a living idea, a collective current of voices held together by trust in chaos. Now, it moved differently, not with openness, with fear. Circles grew smaller, teachings grew sharper, followers began choosing sides, and through it all, the man at the center said nothing. Millennial walked the halls of the stone temple, like a ghost still tied to his place of death. He wasn't dead, but the vision that had carried him was fading. He had survived, but what had survived with him was no longer his. The surviving disciple, the one who had stopped the blades, became a voice of structure. He began teaching refinements, new interpretations of old truths, warnings against spiritual corruption, lessons about loyalty. He never called them laws, but they felt like laws. He never claimed power. But the church began to listen to him more than they listened to the silence. Millennial watched it unfold. Slowly, inevitably, this was not a hostile takeover. It was erosion. One phrase rewritten, one rite changed, one memory adjusted. They began calling the betrayal the night of clarification. They said the prophet had passed a test, that the assassins had only proven the rule of many's endurance. But Millennial knew better. He didn't survive because the rule of many was strong. He survived because it was dying, and didn't know it yet. The doctrine had been built to bend. Now it had learned to harden. He heard teachers warn against questions. He saw elders punish seekers who spoke visions too strange, too dark, too different. He saw mirrors covered in black cloth, because some began claiming the Force showed false reflections. He had taught them to question everything. Now, they questioned nothing. They feared fracture, so they built walls. They feared silence, so they filled it with chants. They feared prophecy, so they turned it into repetition. He no longer spoke during gatherings. His presence was still honored, but no longer needed. He sat behind stone altars as others quoted his words, word by word, with no meaning left in their mouths. And when he walked alone, he noticed something else. The Force had changed. It didn't scream. It didn't whisper. It watched. It watched the way a tired parent watches a child repeat the same mistake. It waited, because it had already seen this story before, and it knew how it ended. So did he. In the quiet of the deepest vault, Millennial sat beneath the ceiling he once carved with his own hands. He stared at the pattern etched there, the spiral of many voices, the open symbol that was never meant to close. But now it was closed, not in stone, in spirit. He whispered, "This is not the doctrine I saw." No one answered. Not the Force, not the temple, not the memory of what this was supposed to be. He rose, and somewhere behind him, in the walls of a church that still bore his name, a new voice prepared to speak, not to continue his vision, to replace it. He left before dawn, not in secrecy, not in fear, but in resignation. The temple was quiet, the air still heavy from the night of betrayal months before. The church slept in its chambers, wrapped not in peace, but in certainty. Certainty he could no longer share. He walked through the red circle, past the stone where his first truth was carved. He touched the words with a trembling hand. "We will not be one." But the circle was no longer many. It was becoming one voice, one doctrine, one direction, all of it shaped by a disciple who now spoke more loudly than the prophet himself. He listened for the Force. For years, it had whispered futures with relentless clarity. Now, it spoke only in fragments, small echoes, soft warnings, faint grief. As he stood beneath the fading stars, he understood. The church no longer needed him. The future no longer required him. And the Force no longer followed him. The only thing that still held him here was memory. He stepped away from the circle, but someone followed, the survivor, the third shadow, the one who had saved him that night, whether out of belief or ambition. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood behind Millennial, his presence steady, his intent unreadable. Finally, he said, "You taught us not to cling to a single path. Why cling to your own?" Millennial turned slowly. "You know what this place will become." The survivor did not deny it. Every movement fractures. Every idea changes hands. Every doctrine is twisted, refined, reshaped. He stepped closer. You should be proud, proud. The word struck harder than any blade. Millennial shook his head. I saw the end of this. I saw where it leads. I know, the survivor said. And that's why you must stay. Millennial studied his face. Not for threat, for truth. You don't want me here for guidance, he said quietly. You want me here for legitimacy. The survivor did not argue. He didn't need to. His silence confirmed everything. The church needed Millennial alive. Not as a prophet, but as a symbol, a seal, a signature, a relic. As long as he stayed, the doctrine would remain pure. As long as he remained, the church could claim it still followed his vision. But that vision had died the moment 3 shadows drew their blades. Millennial stepped back. I will not bless what this becomes. The survivor's expression tightened, not in anger, in fear. Without the prophet, the church risked collapse, or war, or splintering beyond repair. You owe them, he whispered. Millennial lowered his gaze. I owe them honesty, and the truth is, I cannot walk the path they've chosen. For the first time, the survivor's mask cracked. You'll abandon them. No, Millennial said. They abandoned themselves. He walked past him. The survivor didn't stop him, couldn't stop him. Not because he lacked strength, because he lacked certainty. He watched the prophet disappear into the barren horizon, a thin figure swallowed by gray dust and morning light. And in that moment, he understood something Millennial had known for years. A prophet's value ends the moment his voice is not feared. Millennial did not look back, not once. His footsteps faded, his presence dimmed, his shadow vanished between broken rocks and silent winds. Only one man walked away from the doctrine that night, the prophet who created it, and the church, left behind in its growing echo chamber, continued on without him, not realizing yet that the moment he stepped into the distance, its fate was sealed. No one saw him leave. There was no procession, no ceremony, no witness. He walked into the wastes beyond the temple, with the same silence that had followed him all his life. Not as a master, not as a warrior, not even as a prophet anymore. Just a shadow wearing the shape of a man. Years had passed since he last spoke before the church. Even longer since he last raised his hand to teach or warn. What began as a movement of vision had become a monument to stillness. They still whispered his name, inside candlelit chambers, behind veils and mantras, but they no longer listened to his voice, because he no longer used it. He had seen too far, too many futures, too many deaths, too many lies, pretending to be truth, and in each one, his presence vanished. Not in battle, not in fire, but in neglect. He did not seek death, but he no longer fled from it either. Somewhere past the ravines of Dromund Kars, where Sith ruins dissolved into jungle rot, and time forgot how to move forward, he found what he had been looking for. A ruin, not ancient, not powerful, just old enough to feel like it had once mattered. Stone steps crumbled beneath his boots. Vines strangled shattered pylons. And at the center of it all, an altar no longer lit. A place where power once lived, now empty. Like him, he knelt, not to pray, to remember. His body ached, not from age, but from carrying too many futures inside it. He could still feel them, threads of time curling through his mind like smoke, but he no longer tried to understand them, because he now believed the truth wasn't hidden in visions, it was hidden in the silence between them. He closed his eyes. He saw the church, still growing, still lying. He saw Jedi temples far across the stars, teaching peace while quietly fearing what he had once warned. He saw the rule of two, still intact, still claiming power through death, still pretending obedience meant order. He had walked away from all of it, and yet none of it had walked away from him. It lingered in every breath, in the Force, in the memory of who he had tried to be. The Force did not speak to him anymore, but it watched, not in judgment, not in anger, in sorrow, because even the Force understood what he had become: a fracture, a prophecy denied, a voice erased by the very truth it had tried to protect. He laid his hand on the stone floor. It was warm, not from sunlight, from memory. This place had once mattered. He had once mattered. But like this ruin, he had outlived his purpose. And now, he was ready to disappear with it. Not to end a war, not to pass a title, not to leave behind teachings, only to leave. Because sometimes, the most powerful ending is one no one sees. He felt the moment approaching long before his body began to fail. Not through vision, not through prophecy, through exhaustion, a slow, deep exhaustion that lived beneath the bones. The kind that doesn't ask for rest, only release. He remained in the ruins for days, sometimes sitting, sometimes lying against broken stone, sometimes staring at the doorway, as if expecting someone to enter. No one did, not a seeker, not a pilgrim, not even a wanderer lost by chance. It was fitting. A life spent hearing futures would now end in the one future that required no witness. His breath grew shallow, soft, measured. He did not fight. He did not cling. His fingers traced cracks in the stone floor, following patterns carved by centuries of time. They felt like memories, fractured, scattered, incomplete. Just like him, he remembered his childhood. Not the visions, not the prophecies, just the loneliness. He remembered Cognos, her cold eyes, her harsher truths, her failure to break him, and her failure to understand him. He remembered Korriban, the first circle, the fire, the voices whispering hope into a doctrine that was already doomed. He remembered the church, the rise, the fracture, the betrayal, and he remembered walking away, not as a hero, as a man who had finally understood that his story was never meant to be carried by others. He coughed, a thin, weak motion. Specks of red touched his palm. There was no panic, only recognition. The Force remained silent. It did not offer visions. It did not show him one last path. It did not reveal some hidden meaning to his life. It simply sat beside him, quietly, like an old companion who had run out of things to say. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling, toward a patch of sky visible through shattered stone. It was pale, colorless. He found comfort in that. A sky with no color had no allegiances, no destiny, no prophecy, just light. His breathing slowed, not painfully, peacefully. Each inhale shallower, each exhale longer, not letting go, returning. He didn't close his eyes. He wanted to see the last moment, not as a prophet, but as a person. One final truth, unfiltered, unseen. His thoughts dimmed. The pain in his limbs grew distant. His heartbeat weakened into something soft, like footsteps fading down a long hallway. He felt warmth, not from the Force, from within. He whispered something, not a prophecy, Not a scripture, just 2 words, "I tried." The wind carried them away. Before they even settled in the room, his chest rose once more, then lowered, then did not rise again. No one felt a disturbance. No one sensed a shift. No one cried out in fear or triumph. The galaxy did not tremble. The church did not mourn. The Sith did not record it. The Jedi did not notice. He simply stopped breathing, and the ruin held his body with the same indifference it had held the stones of dead empires. Darth Millennial died exactly the way he had lived, alone, unclaimed, unwitnessed, a death not marked by violence, but by absence. There was no monument, no ritual, no last lesson, only stillness, and a body returning to dust. The galaxy moved on, without pause, without memory. Days passed, then weeks, then years, and still no one came. His body turned to dust beneath the collapsed roof of a nameless ruin, far from the tombs of Sith Lords and the temples of Jedi Masters. There was no burial, no pyre, no shrine, just silence. And from that silence, something cruel began to form. Forgetting, the Dark Force Church endured, but it changed, it shifted. Without their founder to interpret the threads of fate, they wrote their own meanings, recast their own visions. They spoke of him not as a man who had lived, but as a myth that had never bled. Some claimed he had ascended into the Force. Others believed he had never existed at all. The rule of many, once a rebellion, became ritual. Its followers stopped questioning, stopped listening. They built structures over his words and buried his defiance beneath layers of sacred repetition. He became a name, then a rumor, then a symbol, and eventually nothing. The Sith refused to acknowledge him. Darth Cognus erased every trace of his teachings. The rule of 2 demanded purity, not heresy, and Millennial was the greatest heretic the Sith had ever known. To mention his name was to admit the rule was breakable. So they did not speak it. The Jedi too remained silent. To them, he had been no threat, just another lost shadow in a long line of Sith apostates. They did not seek his death. They did not investigate his cult. They believed he would fade. And he did. The last records that bore his name were sealed. The last relics that held his touch were locked away. By the time a century passed, only the Force remembered him, and even it had grown quiet. But silence does not mean absence. Not in the galaxy, not in the Force, not in the places where forgotten truths still whisper, through cracks in stone and dust on bone. Deep within the jungle world where he died, the ruin remained, untouched, unseen, unspoken, but not empty, because something lingered in the space where he fell. Not his body, not his power, his echo, an echo made not of words, but of warning. That the Force, when ignored, still speaks. That the future, when feared, still comes. And that sometimes, the ones who disappear, leave behind the loudest silence. His visions had not been false, only mistimed. He had seen wars that would shake the stars. He had seen chosen ones rise from chains. He had seen the Sith fracture again and again. He had seen a galaxy that would forget him, before realizing how much it had needed him. And now, in the silence left behind, that truth began to take shape, not loudly, not urgently, like dew forming on ancient stone. The kind of truth that waits to be heard, waits to be felt, waits to return. And somewhere in that ruin, beneath the crumbled altar, beside the cold earth, where he once whispered his last words, the Force breathed in, soft, slow, unseen, and exhaled his memory. His doctrine was shattered, his name unspoken, his death forgotten. But something remained. It did not glow. It did not burn. It did not command armies or reshape empires. It lingered in shadows, in gaps between truths, in the doubts that took root where certainties once stood. A Padawan studying the archives would pause on a missing scroll. A Sith apprentice wandering Korriban might feel eyes in empty corridors. A Force-sensitive child would hear voices while sleeping under a pale moon. They wouldn't know his name, but they would feel something. Something fractured, something ancient, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And that was how he survived. Not as a ghost, not as a legend, as a question the galaxy could never quite bury. Who decides the future? The Jedi, the Sith, the Chosen, or the one who sees it and chooses to walk away? Millennial never built an empire. He never ruled a system. He never sat on a throne. He didn't need to, because he had touched the Force in a way few ever had. Not with domination, but with fear. He feared what it showed him, and still he listened. He feared what he might become, and still he spoke. He feared the rule of two, not because it was cruel, but because it was incomplete. In his silence, he had said more than most Sith said in lifetimes. And the galaxy listened, even when it didn't understand. Centuries later, when Palpatine rose, some among the old sects remembered the Church. They whispered of a prophet who had predicted it all. The Clone Wars, the Purge, the Fall, the chosen child who would burn and return. They found pieces, fragments of scripture, echoes of doctrine, enough to doubt the story they'd been given. Not enough to prove, never enough for that, but enough to wonder. And wonder is dangerous. It is the crack through which memory returns. In that way, Millennial achieved something even Bane never had. He planted heresy that could not be destroyed. He became a scar that would not heal, not because he struck it, but because he saw it before it formed. He was erased, but not removed, suppressed, but not silenced. And in the cold, long drift of the Force, those are the ones who last, the ones who defy extinction, not by fighting it, but by slipping through it. He did not die for power. He did not die for doctrine. He died because he walked a path that no one else dared follow. A path with no followers, no applause, no glory, only vision, only fear, only truth. And now, in ruins swallowed by time, beneath skies that no longer remember his face, his truth still waits. Not to be worshipped, not to be obeyed, to be heard, in whispers, in tremors, in the deep hum of a Force that never forgets. Darth Millennial was never meant to conquer. He was meant to see. And though the galaxy closed its eyes, his eyes never shut. Not in death, not in silence, not in legacy, because what he saw still waits to be seen. The Dark Force Church was never officially recognized. No temples, no flags, no armies. It spread the way a sickness does slowly, quietly, hidden in the shadows of dying systems and broken colonies. Its disciples didn't preach on holonet broadcasts or in the Senate halls. They whispered in alleyways, in prisons, on ships that never returned to the core. They carried a name few dared to say aloud: Millennial. Not Darth Millennial. Not anymore. Time had stripped away the title, leaving only the ghost. And still, that ghost lingered. It began on remote mining moons where Force sensitives vanished. On the edge of Hutt space, among bounty hunters who felt the Force before they understood it. On backwater worlds where Jedi texts were relics and Sith doctrine was myth. There, the whispers grew roots, and they all pointed backward. They spoke of a man who defied the Sith, who saw a galaxy ruled not by two, but by many. A man who had seen the rise of empires and the death of stars. A heretic, a madman, a god, and yet no one could prove he had lived. The Jedi had nothing in their archives. The Sith had erased him. Even those who followed him had fractured beyond recognition. But the Force had memory. It carried echoes. In the outer rim, those echoes stirred, and those who listened began to believe. They called it the path of the many. Not a religion, not at first, just a thread, a feeling, a hunger, the idea that no one should own the Force, that the Force was not balance or obedience. It was change, and change belonged to everyone. The Jedi ignored them, the Sith mocked them, but they kept multiplying. At first, it was fragments, pieces of old scrolls, names carved into durasteel, prophecies half-remembered from visions. They never mentioned Millennial outright, only hints, symbols, broken starfields drawn in blood. But in those symbols, a shape began to return, a figure standing outside the rule. Not a warrior, not a savior, a warning. There was no movement, no leader, just the Force, pulling dreamers toward a memory that refused to die. In the dark corridors of Nar Shaddaa, in the haunted ruins of Malachor, in hyperspace lanes, where time seemed to warp, they whispered his name like a secret curse. Not because they worshipped him, because they feared he had been right. The galaxy was changing. The Sith were multiplying again, in secret. The Jedi were stretched thin. And somewhere in the cracks of it all, those who had once been dismissed as mad began to speak again. Louder, they spoke of a shadow long forgotten, a Sith who never truly died, a vision that never truly left. Darth Millennial had not returned, but his whisper had. And in that whisper, there was something darker than any lightsaber, something more dangerous than any army. Hope. Hope that the Force belonged not to empires or orders, but to those who dared to question everything, even the past. Especially the past. And so the whisper moved. It passed from generation to generation, from seer to seer. Never the same voice twice, never the same vision, but always the same warning. The rule of two would fall. The chosen one would bring balance. And the galaxy would forget the one who had seen it all first. But the Force would remember, because it always does. The galaxy forgot him, but darkness remembered. Not through monuments or battles, but in broken minds and half-formed dreams. There were children born on the edge of the unknown regions who cried the moment they touched stone once marked with Sith runes. Smugglers who suffered hallucinations after sleeping near old temples. Force sensitives who heard voices while traveling deep space routes long abandoned. They all described the same thing. A tall figure wrapped in shadows, standing still, never speaking. But his eyes glowed, not with fire, with understanding. Some called it a ghost. Some believed it was an echo of Bogan, a leftover dream from the old wars. But a few, U2014, the few who knew the ancient scripts, who could read the forgotten dialects carved into Sith tombs, U2014 recognized the feeling. It was U2019 fear. It was recognition. They didn't U-2019 know his name, not fully, but they remembered the idea, the rebellion against the rule of two, the voice that said the Force could not be controlled. The prophecy of many. They called him the first heretic, and without even knowing his face, they began to follow him. In the Red Nebulae, a cult rose that believed the Force was neither light nor dark, but dream. In the shattered moons of Malrevivi, a group of ex-Jedi painted stars on their bodies and wrote scriptures about a prophet who had seen the end of time. On Dathomir, a young girl who had never left her village spoke in tongues during a storm. Her words translated to one phrase. He warned them. They did not listen. She died hours later. The Jedi dismissed these as scattered delusions. The Sith, in secret, investigated them, but neither found a source, because there was no temple, no scroll, no survivor, only the Force, and it had buried Millennial, U-2019's voice in every crack of the galaxy. Even Darth Sidious heard it once. A dream, long before his rise, a man in yellow eyes standing at the edge of the Sith temple on Coruscant, whispering a future where empires collapsed under the weight of their own greed. Palpatine never saw the figure again, but he remembered the feeling, that chill, that accusation, that warning, and so, even at the height of his power, Sidious erased every fragment that mentioned the rule of many. He destroyed teachings not just because they defied doctrine, U-2014, but because they echoed something he could, U-2019, predict. A prophecy not meant for him. A future that didn't, U-2019, need him. And still, it spread. Because the Force is not a story, it is memory. And what Darth Millennial had seen, felt, and feared could not be killed with silence. It had already taken root. It didn't, U-2019, need armies or apprentices. It needed doubt, and doubt was everywhere. N from the clone troopers who wondered why their minds felt altered, to the Jedi who felt the darkness growing not around them, but inside the Council itself, to the Sith Lords who began to question why two was ever enough. The Force trembled, and in that trembling, a single name, long buried, returned, not as fact, not as proof, but as fear. Millennial, a Sith who abandoned the rule, a madman who had seen too far, a traitor, a prophet, a warning, not a legacy carved in stone, but a shadow burned into the Force itself. It started to happen slowly. A Jedi Knight stationed in the Outer Rim began waking in the middle of the night, breath shallow, heart pounding, convinced he had seen the same red-eyed figure 3 nights in a row. When asked by the Council, he could describe the robes, the posture, even the voice, but not the face. He said it kept shifting, old, young, scarred, healed like a memory too unstable to hold still. He was transferred to the core for evaluation. En Rune, a Sith cult claimed a dying acolyte spoke in a different voice moments before death, one that warned them not of Jedi retaliation, but of internal collapse. The voice had said, "They will fall from the inside, because they believe in order, and order always forgets its flaws." The cult vanished days later. Years passed, then decades, and still, the signs returned like faint echoes rippling through hyperspace, across time, touching only the ones too fragile to be believed. A Padawan on Ossus suddenly knew the word millennial before ever hearing it spoken. A smuggler on Lothal found an amulet that gave her visions of a city burning in silence. A Sith hopeful on Ryloth recited lines of a prophecy he'd never been taught. When the rule becomes law, the dark will rot. And each time, someone covered it up. The Jedi blamed dreams, The Sith blamed treason, but the Force remembered. It always did. For Darth Millennial was never just a man. Not anymore. He had become something else, not alive, not dead, not worshipped, not erased. He was a scar left beneath the skin of the galaxy, and in that scar something stirred. Because the rule of many had not died with him, it had simply changed its shape. The followers who survived the collapse of his dark church carried fragments of his teachings to distant systems. Most were forgotten, some were rewritten, but a few endured. Ideas spread like mold, not with power, but with silence. A belief that the Force itself wanted chaos, that it was not peace or order that birthed destiny but fracture, multiplicity, mutation. And in that quiet philosophy, new heresies bloomed. Knights who walked both paths, apprentices who claimed no master, mercenaries who used the Force as a weapon, but refused the Jedi code and spat on the Sith name. None of them traced their path to Millennial, but all of them walked in his shadow. And somewhere, on a long-forgotten world where no name had meaning, the wind howled through the broken bones of a ruined temple. No one knew who built it. No one remembered what had been prayed for there. But buried beneath ash and stone was a broken mask. Its paint was faded, its surface cracked. The jaw was missing, the eye sockets empty. And still, it watched. Because not all echoes fade. Not in a galaxy built on fear. Not in a Force that holds every breath, every death, every prophecy like blood in its veins. Millennial had spoken of futures, and now the future was speaking back. The Sith never spoke his name again. To them, he had failed. Not in power, but in purpose. He had walked away from the rule. He had dared to believe that prophecy belonged to him, and so they buried him in silence. A heretic, a footnote, a reminder of what happens when madness replaces loyalty. But Darth Sidious knew. He never said it aloud. Not to Maul, not to Tyrannus, not even to Vader, but in the private folds of his mind beyond the masks, beneath the shadows he had read the scrolls. He had heard the warnings. Millennial had foreseen a chosen one. A child born of no father, a slave who would bring fire to the Jedi temple and ash to the stars. And Sidious had found him. But where the prophet had seen endings, the Dark Lord saw tools. Where Millennial had feared fate, Sidious had bent it. That was the difference between a seer and an emperor. Still, even emperors hear whispers. During the construction of the second Death Star, a prisoner on Endor's moon began drawing circles in his cell, each one wider than the last, each one etched with ancient Sith symbols most long erased from holocrons. He never spoke, but one word remained scrawled beneath the final circle: many. After the prisoner died, his body vanished. On Drummond Cars, a young Force adept meditated in the tombs and saw a man standing at the edge of time, no face, no voice, only a finger pointing toward a dark sun. She spoke of the vision during her trials and was executed for blasphemy. Her words were never recorded, but they echoed, because Darth Millennial had not created a doctrine. He had planted a question, and centuries later, that question still infected the Force like rot beneath stone. What if the rule of two was a cage? What if balance was never the goal? What if destiny was plural? He never had an army, never had a throne, never ruled a planet. But still, the wound he left shaped the dark forever. And there were those who remembered, not by name, not by dogma, but in instinct, in whispers, in the way the Force sometimes twisted around those who walked alone. The Sith called them mistakes, the Jedi called them corrupted, but they were neither. They were fragments, splinters of a path carved long ago by a mad prophet in exile. And in them, the rule of many lived on. In silence, in exile, in prophecy, because Darth Millennial's legacy was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be felt. And when the galaxy fell again, when temples burned and empires rose from flame, the Force would remember, not the name, not the face, only the echo.